I want to tell you about my nightmare. This started in 2006, and in one short year I went from having retired early, having been a successful international antiques dealer, to being what could have only been described, if you'd have looked at me, as being a dispossessed person, perhaps a homeless street person. It started after the trauma of the breakup of my relationship. This followed a short spell of being depressed and being in the private sector, and the depression coming back. And I went to a private hospital in London and was sectioned from there. From the private hospital, where I was very distressed and talked about only wanting to end my life, after being there approximately 3 weeks, the insurance ran out and I was transferred back to the country mental hospital where I had been living for the past 2 years. Treatment was to treat me in a sort of way that they didn't look at the trauma, they just looked at this was a person who was acting strange, wanting to end their life. There was no talking therapy, but the treatment that they commenced on giving me was ECT. I had no knowledge of ECT, I didn't even know what the initials stood for. But when they said they thought this would help me, feeling as I did, I went along with it, really. Anything that would help, I would have said yes to. If they'd have said, basically, cut off one of your arms, I'd have agreed to it. So I agreed and thought that this might help. I still felt as bad. I now understand ECT needs various legal requirements before given. None of these were adhered to. I also understand that it is given much more rarely now than it was at one time, but this hospital didn't seem to think that, as they gave it in huge numbers. 12 sessions of ECT, and I was put on lithium. And in all this time, I didn't used to talk. I had one friend in the hospital. I was pretty much left to my own devices, which was just lying in a room all day long and coming out for the inadequate food. I stayed there for 9 months, and after 9 months I went to live in a community house. Now, after the ECT and when I came out of hospital, I still had, well, my thoughts were really, when is this going to go away? When am I going to get help? When is anyone going to give therapy? This was never forthcoming. It never happened. And to this day, 6 years later, it still hasn't happened. And I'm sure it never will. Now, I had an allocated social worker, and to say that she was inadequate is an understatement. To say that she was incompetent is an understatement. To say that she certainly shouldn't have been in that job is another understatement. And what she did when I got evicted from yet another communal house, what she did was go with me with my carrier bag and I think a pair of shoes, because that was all I had, in the bag that I took in there. And firstly, she was going to put me in a place where it's like rooms where you could cook for yourself and things like that in a kitchen, communal kitchen. But I took one look at the place. It was in the middle of nowhere and I didn't want it. So I spent probably the next hour phoning, trying to find a different hotel, and came up with one. And after registering, she left and she didn't return and visit me for 5 months. I had gone from somebody who was very conscious of my appearance and certainly hygiene, to what can only be described as somebody who looked like they'd lived on the street for a long time. And bearing in mind this had taken no more than 2 or 3 months, but things were to get much worse, and I didn't know in the 5.5 years, that this was left to deteriorate with the wrong treatment. So, gone from being well respected, successful, early retirement, very early retirement, to scruffy, unwashed, unkempt, no feeling, neither hot nor cold, thirsty or hungry, never watched television, never picked up a book, never did any of the things that are associated with being human. At this time, agoraphobia had set in, and being, although considered unhealthy, there's a lot more unhealthy habits. Being a smoker, I was even reduced to picking up goggins in the street or asking strangers for cigarettes. Again, with no care, with no therapy, and it was at this time that the suicide attempts started. Suicide attempts first started with walking in front of traffic and trying to get run over. And this was something which is almost impossible to do, because as soon as a car sees you, it swerves or puts its brakes on, and within 20 minutes someone's called the police, and the police would arrive. The ambulance would take me off, or the police would take me off to what they call a 136 suite, where I'd be asked, did I know what I was doing? It was pretty apparent that I did, where up to 4 o'clock in the morning I would just be sent home in a taxi. Back to the same situation, and the whole thing would start again probably a week later. I remember going in front of a large, very large lorry, and the lorry driver almost jackknifed and came running into the hotel very angry and said, is this woman staying here? And they said yes. And he just said, well, why don't someone do something about it? I was just concerned. And he was angry, because had he have hit me, it would have meant possibly he could no longer drive a lorry. But on many evenings I would go to the 136 suite, come back in the early hours of the morning, and although at one time the manager of the hotel phoned the hospital and said, is there nothing can be done? And all they had to say to him was, are you a relative? No, he wasn't. Then they could make no comment. It depends how naughty I was. If I was very naughty and tried these things many times, then they made my appointments with the psychiatrist further apart. The worse I behaved in that way, the less they saw me. And they threatened me with not seeing me at all. There couldn't be any more, quote, incidents, or else they wouldn't be able to see me anymore. I knew in the hotel I would die. I would die in that hotel. I would die. I was befriended by an old man at one time, a very old man in his mid-80s, who tried to contact the social services, although he also wasn't a relative, but just someone who could not believe that something so bad was happening. The elderly friend that I made in the hotel thought that it was inconceivable that somebody so focused on ending their life would just be left. And in the end I wasn't left anymore, and after various other unsuitable places to live, one after another, and more suicide attempts, I finally went into hospital where I almost thought I was never going to come out. hadn't ever taken drugs, whether recreational, street drug or whatever you want to call it, hadn't been part of my life ever. Lorazepam, for those that don't know about that drug, is something that should be administered, if administered at all, for 4 to 6 weeks, and I had been on it for 18 months. It's probably true to say that I would have killed for the drug that I was on. The dosage that they gave me was exceedingly high. I was very addicted to it, and they did nothing basically. And then when it had got out of hand, within about a week and a half, they'd got me into a hospital that I had wanted to get into 6 months before, but they'd refused that on the grounds of funding. But suddenly the funding was there, now that they'd got me and made me into an addict. So I then went and stayed there. No reason to give me a major tranquilizer. I was neither violent or abusive or shouting. I didn't do anything that you give lorazepam for. Staff virtually ignored you. I spoke to anybody at all was probably for 15 minutes in the ward round, where almost every time I would walk out, because it was no, I might as well have been talking to the wall. So I just would leave and go back to my room, where I spent approximately 17 hours a day in, with the exception of the 15 minutes you were allowed to eat your food. I don't think anyone can cope with being shut away in a hospital such as that. I would wager that there isn't a person in any position who could be put under those circumstances and remain sane. Because sane is not something that you can remain. And the only way you can remain a little bit sane is to imagine you're not there. And I think this has been brought up with people that are in atrocity situations in current occupied countries and things like that. And you have to imagine you're not there. And the drugs helped me imagine I wasn't there. That's why I wanted them. The more I took, the more they gave me, the more they increased the dosage, the easier it was for me to imagine I wasn't there. They could have done the same probably with heroin, but it's probably too expensive. I would wake up, shall we say 8 o'clock, and almost count the minutes till they would have been allowed to give me another dose. And then I'd do the same in the afternoon, and the whole cycle would start every day the same. Under the medication you could go into another world quite easily. You could imagine yourself not in the scenario of maybe what I would have thought if they were making a 21st century concentration camp. Perhaps it would be something like the NHS hospital that I was in. No torture was given, but to say that I was 6 stone, and although I'd like to be a little less than I am now, 6 stone is perhaps a bit less rather than I'd like to be. 6 stone means you have no energy. It means, yeah, lying down's okay. Getting up and walking, pretty much out of the question. Almost anything's out of the question. 6 stone is anorexia weight. So if you chop me almost in half, gives you an idea. Number one, when I was out of hospital, I ate almost nothing. And when I was in hospital, I didn't eat that much.
So the staff in the hospital must have seen you weren't eating?
They didn't care. They did not care. Very occasionally they would weigh people, which is in effect how I know I was 6 stone. There it is glaringly in my medical notes for all to see. 18 months, it went on for 18 months. When I think someone must have thought, I think someone got worried, because the hospital I know that took me in, the private hospital that I went to, normally would take, I think, about 6 weeks to admit anyone, and I went in about a week and a half. What should have been done was very simple. What should have been done was asked why. Why did I want to kill myself? Simple, small word, why. Nobody asked that. Nobody, not one person ever asked me why I wanted to end my life. Not really normal. Certainly not normal to wander in front of traffic and hope a lorry hits you. It's certainly not normal to take vast amounts of medication and hoping you won't wake up. It's not normal to break into a swimming pool, as one night I did, and contemplate drowning, more than contemplate, fully intend to drown myself. It's just, it was an outdoor one and it was too cold. An indoor one would have perhaps been a bit better, but it was too hard to break into an indoor one, and an outdoor one was a lot easier. Surely it is time to ask a simple question, very simple: why? I had to use a solicitor for a family matter, and that solicitor was aware that I was ill. I was quite ill at the time this took place. And that solicitor managed to charge me probably 10 times what he would normally charge. A regulated solicitor, not a backstreet charlatan. Regulated by the Solicitors Regulated Board. And what does society do? Nothing. Ombudsman is where you can go to. What do they do? Nothing. It's called legal. You can legally take anybody for a ride. You can legally do that, because when you're vulnerable and someone professional says, I can do it, no problem, and you go along with it. Basically being exploited, which you've got exploitation and you've got stigmatised, you've got both. The thing I wasn't prepared for was the horrendous stigma. In history, and we see that, yeah, they were stigmatised years ago, they locked people up, they pretended it wasn't in their family. There are many incidents where they pretended they're not even in the family tree anymore. In a way, we haven't moved on. The stigma that I think used to happen in the 17th, 18th century, those days they were burning witches. At least they were putting them out their misery, because now you were living with the stigma. You were seeing people maybe that you'd known before, and you were unaware and unprepared for just being ignored, because they had seen you when you were ill, and they expected you, not that you'd done anything strange, but they had expected you to still be ill. How could you get them to believe that you were now well? Well, that's something I still haven't discovered, and that's the path I'm on at the moment. People that have it hide. They hide the fact that they've got it. They don't want anyone to know. And only when we can all say it's okay to have various mental imperfections, only then will we have a world that says it's okay to have those things, it's okay, my friends have it, mother has it, daughter has it, and you know what, I've got it. We just fired everyone who had a mental illness. I don't think we'd have many people in employment. What do we say now? How many unemployed? What is it, 3 million? Well, it would certainly jump. And what about in Parliament? What about if we asked everyone in Parliament that they have? We'd have nobody in the House of Lords, the House of Commons. We'd have empty seats, a lot of empty seats, a hell of a lot. We could go to the media, and we could go to television, and we could see how many people there, and we could have some empty seats. Newsreaders would suddenly not be newsreaders anymore. And then after we'd done the newsreaders and the politicians, we could move on to the schools, we'd have no teachers. We'd have a lot of empty places. Do we want to live in a world like that? Or do we say no? And then we can move on, we can have judges, then we can move on religion, we'd have ministers, all denominations. We'd have a lot of empty places. We'd have a world which wasn't working anymore, because it would be empty. And what do? Well, maybe it would be a good idea that we could get an island and perhaps put everyone on the island who's had that. But I don't think we'd find an island big enough. America might work. We can now see how ridiculous it is. How ridiculous. And the only way we're going to say it is by everyone who's had it to come out, a large coming out and do it. Everyone who has had an illness to tell somebody, tell everybody, scream it. If everybody who has had an illness told everybody, then everybody couldn't not speak to everybody they know. It wouldn't be everybody, one in three. 1 in 3 is a lot of people, it's millions, it's not hundreds, millions. And if millions of people suddenly had nobody to talk to, they would have to talk to them. Because it would be everyone,